Hello and welcome. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this fascinating session on the dilemma of the disciplines, STEM or social sciences or both. I'm going to introduce our panel in just a moment, but before I do that, I want to contextualize what this discussion is really going to be focused on. We're at a time of technological transformation. Artificial intelligence is growing by leaps and bounds pretty much every day, taking over repetitive tasks, asking us as scholars, professionals, as students to try and challenge ourselves with new developments. But it's also a reminder of how important it is that we track where human skills become more and more relevant. While technology can assist us in a host of tasks, we have to think about teamwork, we have to think about creativity, we have to think about adaptation. And to think about all of this critically, we have to wonder how curriculum needs to change for those aspiring to enter the traditional STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, but also, if we look at the other side of it, those who are looking to enter the liberal arts fields, which have traditionally been centered around purely soft skills, and whether the separation of these two categories can exist in the same way that they have in the traditional education of the last 400 years. Proficiency in the arts and understanding of human behavior, ideas of empathy and social skills are more important today than they possibly ever were before. And understanding how that is operationalized first in the educational setting, and then how that will lead us forward into the professional setting of the future is the conversation that we're going to focus on today. The notion of the knowledge of many arts or the liberal arts and how that meshes with STEM, with increased capacities and problem solving and communication skills is something that can only be done through a holistic and multidisciplinary education approach. In India today, that conversation has been emphasized and driven in the National Education Policy of 2020. Globally, different fora have been talking about it and emphasizing it. And we can see these shifts start to take place. But today we've got our panel here to tell us what they think the future should or is going to, or both, look like. So on that note, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We've got Dr. David C. Malloy from who is joining us now. He's a Western alumnus who's earned his bachelor's and master's degree from the Western's Faculty of Physical Education, his doctorate in educational administration from the University of Ottawa. In 2019, Dr. Malloy was named the principal of King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario, a title that was changed to president in 2021, which is the capacity in which he joins us today. And this follows his 30-year career with the University of Regina, both as a faculty member and as an administrator, holding the roles of Assistant Dean of the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies, Associate Dean in the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research, Associate Vice President Research, and Vice President Research. As those titles may have possibly informed you, he has an active research portfolio with a focus on applied philosophy in healthcare. His interests include ethical decision-making, codes of ethics, existential hardness, personhood, and ethical climate culture. During his academic career, he has published 6 books and 67 peer-reviewed articles, contributed to 3 book chapters, 7 book reviews, given 81 conference presentations, and has received more than $4.5 million in team and individual research grants. And in his spare time, Dr. Malloy is an active musician, a bass guitarist, and a vocalist, and enjoys sports, and was the head track and field coach for the University of Western Ontario. It's absolutely wonderful, Dr. Malloy, to have you join us today. Moving on, we've got Dr. Stuart Mccook, who's joining us. He's the Assistant Vice President, International Office of International Strategy and Partnerships at the University of Guelph. Dr. Mccook began his term as Assistant Vice President International at the University of Guelph in August of 2019. During his term, Stuart launched the university's inaugural Global Engagement Plan 2022 to 2025, He continues to lead its implementation across 3 campuses. Since 2003, he has been a member of the university's history department and currently holds the rank of professor. From 2009 to 2015, he was the Associate Dean Research and Graduate Studies for the College of Arts. And before joining the University of Guelph, he taught for 6 years at the College of New Jersey and held an NSF postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Minnesota. He completed his PhD at Princeton University in 1996, and his historical research focuses on the environmental history of agriculture in the Global South, especially the history of coffee cultivation. And last but not least at all, we've got Dr. Pramath Raj Sinha. Dr. Sinha is the founder and trustee of Ashoka University. He's also the founder and managing director of the 9.9 Group, which has interests in media, strategic advisory services, and higher education. Dr. Sinha's primary interest lies in building high-quality institutions of higher education. He's the founding dean and the member of the executive board of the Indian School of Business, which has rapidly become one of the top 20 business schools globally. He's also founded Harappa Education, which is striving to become India's largest online institution focused on teaching habits and skills critical to workplace success in the 21st century. Dr. Sinha received a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. It is wonderful to welcome all of you, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Mccook, and Dr. Sinha, to this panel. I would like to begin with asking each of you in turn to lay the foundations of what this discussion should be about going forward. A few opening statements about where we are situated today and what you think the needs of the hour really looks like. So Dr. Malloy, could we start with you?
Dr. Sen, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to be part of this panel. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. And in fact, it's one that doesn't make me get out of bed in the morning, it makes me jump out of bed in the morning because I really feel quite passionate about it. I think now I'm the president of a liberal arts university, so you can imagine I have a bias here. And I think what liberal art universities, well, in fact, universities in general, to say nothing of governments, have really done a really poor job in promoting the relevance of liberal art, humanities, social science disciplines. And I think to our peril. We, of course, have seen so much emphasis on STEM subjects in terms of government funding, so in terms of jobs. I think many parents would prefer many of their students to be STEM students as opposed to humanities and social science. And I think that's a mistake. Certainly, we all have leanings toward one discipline or another. But to focus all of our attention on one side of this equation has been, I think, short-sighted. My view is that we don't need to pit humanities, social science against STEM subjects. I think what we really need to start doing right away, this afternoon, this evening, is really start to have the discussion as we're having tonight about how these two almost the tale of two cities. How do these two perspectives really see the value in each other and really start to work very closely together to solve world problems? So, for example, climate change is not going to be solved by scientists alone. Climate change is going to require policymakers. It's going to require change agents. It's going to require communication. It's going to require philosophers. The crisis in the Ukraine right now isn't going to be solved necessarily by engineers or how do we make better tanks. It's going to be solved by individuals who are able to negotiate, to understand the human condition. So I think what we need to do as universities, and frankly, I'm very connected with the Chamber of Commerce here in not only in my own province, but also nationally, on how businesses can recognize really the relevance of humanities and social science degrees. And one more thing before I stop, you can tell I'm a little excited about this. Part of our problem is that we haven't really universities haven't assisted our students in the humanities and social science how to communicate the value of their degree. So often a student will be a graduate of, let's say, philosophy, and not really have the skill set to go to an employer, whoever that might be, and explain to them that what their degree means is critical thinking. It means creativity. It means adaptability. It means flexibility, and so on and so forth. All the soft skills that you mentioned. If we can start to really explain and better communicate what it is that we do in the humanities and social sciences, I think we'll have a better opportunity to see that blend happen between STEM and social science and humanities. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Malloy, and I'm going to take your Tale of Two Cities metaphor and hope that it is the best of times and not the worst of times. And I'm going to move on now to Dr. Mccook. If you could lay out some sort of initial statements for us to consider.
Sure. Before I do that, I'm just going to say about 6 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of visiting both JGU and Ashoka, and I'm grateful to both institutions for the warm welcome I received while I was there. So, and I look forward to continuing this conversation virtually today. Yeah, I started off, first of all, if you're going to be looking for argument among the panelists, I know at least I'm not going to be arguing with David Malloy. I think we're on this on the same side, and I'm just going to take it from a slightly different perspective, or just kind of riff on some of the things he was saying. When I started looking at the title here, The Dilemma of the Disciplines, STEM or Social Sciences or both, I think in some ways the answer that I think we're all probably drawn to right away is short and simple, which is it's both, right? We got to do both. But that's a short and simple answer and doesn't lead to very interesting conversations. I think the question is, there's a longer and a more complicated answer. And it's kind of the answer behind it is one that's kind of made university administration attractive to me, which is something that you perhaps don't often hear a lot of people say. But the question is what you talked about at the beginning is about operationally, what do you do with that? What university leaders constantly grapple with at almost every level is, yes, I think we're all there with both. We need to do both. But our job to a large extent is to take a finite pot of resources and allocate it. And the question is, what do you do? Where do you allocate these finite resources in the world of a range of different sciences, a range of different social sciences, a range of different humanities within the university so that the university can do its task? These decisions about how you allocate resources between sciences and social sciences and the humanities vary a lot between institutions, and to a certain extent, that's naturally okay. I know one of our speakers, who I guess isn't here today, is from a petroleum university, and I think it's appropriate that a university like that dedicate its resources to funding research and teaching in science and engineering. The IITs are another great example of that. I know both Ashoka and Jindal tend to skew a little more towards the liberal arts, although I know both are interested in developing the sciences as well. And I think it's part of a good liberal arts education necessarily includes education in the sciences. But in practice, as we all know, the decisions are rarely a simple, operationally in real life, are rarely a simple dilemma between STEM or the social sciences. They're a lot more nuanced than that. And in fact, that's where the creativity in running a university and in shaping the curriculum and in shaping the research agenda comes in, is to find, and here I echo David, is to find ways of encouraging collaboration between STEM disciplines and the social sciences to address the largest problems that the world is confronting today. I think all of us at our universities can find tangible examples to do so. I can think of many at Guelph. One of the ones that's come up recently that I think captures some of the things that you've been both talking about is we've got this new Center for Advancing Responsible and Ethical Artificial Intelligence. I mean, it's hard to open a newspaper or click on a website today without hearing about ChatGPT. And the question is, well, what do we do with that? And this center, which we call CARE-AI, brings together researchers from all across campus, the technical researchers who have the competence to understand the artificial intelligence, and then the philosophers and the political scientists and policy people who are exploring, well, how do we operationalize all of this in an ethical way? And in some ways, that's the most exciting part of the university, is being able to facilitate and support this kind of research and teaching. In my previous life as a historian, and perhaps my future life as a historian, I taught humanities to our engineering students. All of our engineering students have to take a science and society class in which they learn to think about their technical profession also in historical context, and understand that the science and the technology that they do are embedded at particular societies, at particular historical moments, and are in many senses value laden, although our students don't often think about that value context. I'm sure your universities all have comparable projects, and this is in fact what all of our stakeholders want. Our students, our governments, our business, our civil society want. They want the universities to provide society with holistic solutions to these problems. And just to echo what David said, the problems of our day, climate change, hunger, poverty, if you look at almost any of the sustainable development goals, they're never just technical problems. I think at times there's a very powerful discourse that would like us, and we see this a lot among some political and thought leaders, to say, we can solve all of these problems technically. We can sort of circumvent this is in some ways the story, well, some of the stories of the 20th century is we can engineer our way out of having to deal with the politics. And I think one of the lessons we've learned in the early 21st century is there is no way of doing that. We need to embrace the culture. We need to embrace the politics, embrace the society as part of the larger solution to social problems, which of course involve technical disciplines as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mccook. And I think that really sort of sets up several themes that we're going to carry forward in this conversation. I think I'd just like to remind our viewers, in the context of what Dr. Mccook said, that Isaac Newton was on record about saying that he was influenced by philosophers like Descartes. And I don't think that we can think of these two people separately in the work they have done. And that's, I think, something we should keep in mind. Let's move to Dr. Sinha. Dr. Sinha, I think this is a conversation that's relatively new in India. When I went to college 15 years ago, it was not a conversation that was taking place. The work you have done, the work that Professor Raj Kumar have done, have changed that conversation. But I think these conversations have been taking place in Western spaces longer than they have been taking place in ours. Where do you think we are at as far as that conversation is concerned?
So I think the conversations are very advanced. If you look at our national education policy in 2020 that everybody talks about, they clearly it clearly encapsulates this whole idea of a multidisciplinary, holistic education. In fact, the policy did use the word liberal arts to signify the new set of universities, the model for new universities, chose to change it to the word multidisciplinary, but it really captures the essence of what we are talking about here. It's harder to implement, though. And to do that in existing institutions, and I think in the write-up for this panel, there was some reference to sort of breaking down the silos or barriers, and that's always tough to do. Change is always difficult. Our training as academics is in silos, and increasingly it's changing, but that training is more after the fact. After you finish your PhD. I was very lucky many years ago to do a PhD in a liberal arts institution in a very technical subject. And so I was forced to collaborate, and I was forced to do interdisciplinary work. I had my PhD was in robotics, and I had a advisor who was a computer scientist, but my major was mechanical engineering, and one of my thesis committee members was a psychologist. So I saw the value of that very early on, and I saw some of us who kind of forced this conversation were just driven by our own personal journeys. Like you, Kajori, I studied in India, and in those days, I studied metallurgical engineering, which was based on my rank in the entrance test to the IITs. It has nothing to do with my interest or where I was headed, and I've never really done any metallurgy in my life since those 4 years of being forced to study what I never really chose to study. So I think the changes are being brought about. Most of us now realize that increasingly what we end up doing in our careers has very little to do with what we studied as a major. And that's the life experience of most people. So I find that initially it was a bit of a challenge to sell the idea of liberal arts in India, and people thought we were talking about performing arts and creative arts. But the moment you turn to them and say, listen, what did you study and what do you do now? And then you tell them, well, that's what really liberal arts education is about, that it doesn't matter what you majored in. People get it. So the conversations are happening. I think it's challenging to implement it. It's no surprise that it's therefore institutions like Jindal, like Priya, like Shiv Nadar, like Ahmedabad University, like Azim Premji University and Ashoka that are bringing this as examples, benchmarks, role models in India. This has been practiced all over the world, but it's very new in our country. But it is spreading, and it's spreading, if I may say, almost like wildfire. I think IIT Gandhinagar, under the leadership of Sudeep Jain, brought that in from the very first day when it was set up. And it's probably the first ever IIT out of the 20 odd IITs that tried to do this. So I think the narrative, the conversations, the policy is all in place. I think the challenge for us is how do you make it happen? I'm building a design-based university in Ahmedabad. And I just came away from a 3-day conference on the future of learning. And when it first came up, I was like, what are we discussing the future of learning at a design school? And then our team called me and said, hey, that's all about designing the new future of learning. And that's why we are doing it. And it was amazing to see the multidisciplinarity present there. And I learned quite a few things from just being there. So I do think that this is happening. It was a long time coming. It had to happen. Incidentally, not to promote it, but just to say the mindset I come from, and excuse me, like Dr. Cook said, I don't have a debate with what the panel is about. We are all here preaching to the converted. But I just wrote a book, and it's called Learn, Don't Study. It's out on the stands. And the main thesis of the book is, parents come to me all the time with their kids, and they think that I should figure out for their kids what they should study so that they can be successful in life. And I start by telling them, I don't know. Nobody knows. If somebody is giving you a test and saying, you should go and build a career in X, Y, or Z, they are just doing some hocus pocus. Don't at all fall for that, because these tests have not even factored in what careers might exist in the future. And again, this is stuff that you've heard talk about. So I do think that we have to move. If you ask me what the radical future could be, I don't think we would have this STEM, STEAM, humanities, social science distinction. We are all going to live longer. We are all going to constantly want to learn and be curious. And so learning, instead of being the 4 years of college, is our whole lifetime. These days, I'm obsessed about how an East India company, a corporation, took over a country. And earlier, it was the purview of historians. Today, it is the curiosity of a person. who's been in business all his life and is saying, wow, how could they actually take over a country? And so all of us are going to study all our lives, learn all our lives, span disciplines all our life. All of us are learning about what is meant by large language models. Who thought we would be talking about Chat GPT and trying to understand what it really does and what it really doesn't do? And all of us are having to school. We are not now doing a computer science major, but we are doing a mini course in computer science. So I think with lifelong learning, these distinctions and disciplines are going to go away. All of us are going to study all over the place, whenever we want, however we want. And ultimately, it's going to come down to our ability to solve some of the toughest problems that the world faces. I think more and more people with a college education have a responsibility, especially in countries like ours, because there are so few of us relative to the larger population, and our problems are so great that the more, if you will, learned people don't engage on the toughest problems, who will? And they are going to need multidisciplinarity. So if you go back to the traditional model, then at Ashoka, the computer scientist with the biology minor and the environmental studies concentration is going to have to look at pollution in Delhi, analyze that data, figure out what health effects the pollution is having and what the environmental causes are of those health effects. And without that, we won't solve for the pollution in Delhi and the harmful effects on human beings. So for the wicked problems to get solved, we have to have people trained in multiple disciplines, whether you call it STEM, STEAM, liberal arts. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up after that, is that there's also a very strong sense in young people that they want to learn, study, work in fields that they love, they enjoy, they find some meaning, some purpose, something beyond just the job. And it sounds like a bit of a pipe dream to say this, but I work a lot with young people, and it's true for people from modest backgrounds who want just a job, to people who come from very privileged backgrounds. I think in our generation, we never cared about our purpose and our mission and our meaning and what we feel passionate and what we love. I think the younger generation cares about that much more. Good news is they have the opportunity, so they can afford to care about. We didn't, so we went with whatever we got. And that is also driving a lot of the change, will drive a lot of the change, I believe. Because people feel it's their right to explore, their right to discover, their right to figure out and be curious. And that's a good thing in general for the world, challenging for us as educators. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha. And that's, I think I have to now let our audience know that they've been clickbaited into the session. It's not a dilemma of the disciplines. I think we're all in agreement that it should be both. So keeping that in mind with what you've just laid out, before I start asking...
Kajori, I wanted to make a liberal arts observation, which is kind of tongue-in-cheek, if I may. Do you know that you are actually sitting with 3 Canadians? I don't know if David is also Canadian, but I'm actually a Canadian citizen. I lived in Canada. My first job was with the University of Toronto. So it's quite a coincidence that amongst this large number of panels that you have in this session, you found 3 Canadians to deliberate this issue.
That is incredible. That is a fascinating little factoid right there. So let's leave it to the Canadians to take us forward in this conversation. Okay, I just want to let our audience know that if they can leave questions for our panelists in the chat box, we will be taking those questions up shortly. But before that, I'm going to put a few questions to them. So before we talk about what we can do to fix the challenges, shall we say? Shall we lay out what the challenges themselves are at the moment? As university administrators, as teachers, as institution builders, what are the fundamental challenges you see towards bringing a truly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary system in place? Dr. Malloy.
Thank you. That's one heck of a question. I think if I could just go back for a moment to what one of the many things that Dr. Sinha, I'd love to have a conversation with both of you, Stuart and Dr. Sinha. It's not so much the silos as degrees that really concern me. I think if one is going to be an engineer, I certainly want engineers to be highly qualified as I drive across their bridges or drive in their cars. I think the real challenge for us is once we graduate and our students are employed in the many jobs that they're going to have, that there's a willingness and an understanding that they then absolutely should get out of their silos. I think it's the willingness to be open to having conversations. If I'm a philosopher or if I'm an English major, how do I engage in a conversation with someone who is from a STEM field? And how do each of us understand that we're going to come to a better solution by having our disciplines engage with each other? So that's one thing. I think it's our ability to teach our students to be open to those possibilities. I think the other important factor for us is I think really convincing students and perhaps their parents that it's okay to have their, I won't say child, to have their student in a liberal arts or humanities and social science discipline. I think we can all talk about disruptive technologies. My heavens, I don't know what we're going to do with ChatGPT. Stuart, I don't know if Guelph has figured that out, but we certainly haven't. But those kinds of disruptive technologies will continue. The successful student is going to be one that is going to, I guess, be able to be adaptable and flexible when those disruptive technologies occur. I gave an address to a graduating student body last night, and I suggested to them that the job that they're going to get next year will not be the same job that they get in 2 years, or the same job that they'll have in 5 years or 15 years. And that's okay. And the fact that they studied in a particular discipline, whether it was psychology or sociology or social work, the beauty of them having graduated from a liberal arts university is that they've got that capacity to be flexible and adaptable. So I don't know if I think I've probably gone off on a bit of a tangent, Dr. Sen, I'm sorry, but it's I think a big challenge we have, certainly my university has, is entering into that dialogue with government, with businesses, with Chamber of Commerce, to let them be aware that this is an important interaction that we have to have. And once we are competent, perhaps once we're competent in our silos, how do we then break out of them to really start problem solving? So I'll stop there.
Dr. Sinha, what would you say you feel are the challenges that we face right now?
I think the challenges that I find are still around I think David talked about the students and the parents. I think somewhere in terms of the education part of this, it's really still convincing people that this highly multidisciplinary model will not disadvantage folks in any way. And I think parents particularly have a hard time understanding that, because they've still come from the older mindset. And I was saying earlier about what seems to work is just pointing fingers back at them or showing them the mirror rather than trying to make an argument. But even that is, when it still keeps coming back. So I think that mindset shift is an important one. I dare say that sometimes employers and folks that who should be rewarding such learning are not quite ready as well. I find, what kind of graduate is this, or what kind of education is this? It's so I think that is another mindset issue that needs to change. A little bit on the faculty side as well. At Ashoka, we often run into a tussle about this breadth versus depth debate. A lot of folks who come from the more traditional programs in India feel like we are not giving them enough depth in the discipline that they claim to be a major in, and that they will therefore not do well enough because they didn't get those extra 2, 3, 4 courses. And you and I know that, frankly, it doesn't matter. If people really needed those courses, they will figure it out, they will do it, they will pick their instead of doing their electives in another area, they will do it in their major. But there is this fear that somewhere we are not giving the students enough of math, enough of physics, and I think that again comes from the mindset that folks have been brought up in. So I think it's really a mindset shift. The last thing I will say, that as an administrator, this is a little bit complicated to manage, this fluidity, right? If you're able to say, I'm going to have 50 people in psychology, 50 people in physics, 50 people in computer science, 50 people in, it's just easier to plan and so on. But it comes at the expense of not being able to do what we just talked about. The last thing I will also say is that, and that's my last point, is that often hiring faculty in that model is also tough. So a computer science professor, and by the way, we've chosen to include computer science in our liberal arts offering. And, the definition of what subjects constitute a liberal arts offering has evolved over centuries, and there's no reason it can't continue to evolve. So we chose to call ourselves a liberal arts and sciences institution, but computer science has been very much part of our institution from day one. When a computer science faculty is being hired, they naturally compare us to an IIT or an institution like a TIFR or an ISC. And you would know these are institutions in India that focus much more on technology and science. And then for them, the fear is, am I going to be at a disadvantage being at a liberal arts institution because, they are not focused? So all of these things are in different stakeholders' minds, right? From parents to students to faculty to administrators to policymakers. And I think it'll take time to change that mindset, but that is the biggest challenge, is this mindset that runs across.
I had many, many questions, and I am not going to be able to ask any of them because audience questions seem to be flooding in. So I'm going to use Dr. Sinha's comment here to actually do a segue to a question we've got, which I think fits into this conversation. I'm going to put this question to you, Dr. Mccook, which is, we can keep asking students to look beyond binaries in our classes, yet we're always debating on the binaries like the ones in this debate. Why is it so difficult to change the mindsets of academics and policymakers?
I would say in some cases, and I'm thinking about a particular conversation I had with a fairly senior person who works at one of our provincial ministries, who I met at an event. And often I don't think it's the policymakers who are the problem. I think I talked to him, I met him, I was describing what I did, and he goes, Stuart, we need, he goes, you're sending us a lot of scientists. Our university sends a lot of scientists to this particular department where this guy was from. He goes, they're all great at the science, but none of them can write. He goes, we need scientists who can write. And by writing, I'm not just talking about the kind of narrow skill of being able to complete a sentence, but it's the whole mindset of being able to articulate what they're doing, translate their technical work into policy language, and often the difference between what makes a decent scientist or engineer and an outstanding science and engineer, particularly in their work and professional life, is that ability to connect the technical of what they're doing to the larger thing. So policymakers, I would say, aren't the problem. I think we've seen here, there are some academics that are the problem. Some academics, but I would say even for most of us, that's changing. And I really want to echo something that I've heard from both of the other speakers too, is that we hear a lot about interdisciplinarity, and I think all three of us have, in one way or another, said we need disciplinarity as well. Obviously, we need people who are strong in the disciplines, but we also need to have them be able to step back and see their disciplines in the larger context, whether that be the humanists seeing the scientific context. I think it is sometimes we are our own worst enemy. When we come and have events like this and frame it as a science versus social sciences thing, that can be a problem. And I think we need to change the discourses on that and ask, how do we play together? And I think also just even it gets down into secondary schools. And high schools as well, and the whole lifelong learning and learning to valorize, and it's a problem in North America too with humanities degrees, where the joke is, oh, you want fries with that, assuming that if you get a bachelor's degree in the humanities, you're going to somehow wind up working at McDonald's or something like that, when in reality, many of us go on to do other things. I would say too, within, and I see this a lot in real life. I'm a humanist who teaches a lot of engineering students, and I've had throughout my entire career in teaching humanities to engineering students in various contexts, I've had engineering students come to me and say, I'm interested in the humanities, and I'm thinking about switching my major, but my parents would never let me do this because they think, and I've spent a lifetime trying to nuance that, trying to think of ways they can incorporate humanities into their engineering career, but it's a deeply rooted, in some ways, social issue that is present across many cultures around the world. One of the things I would say that I like is universities can do creative things, though, to create those spaces for students. And I'm one of them too, who have feet in both technical and humanistic disciplines. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, so I have that Canadian connection to our colleague as well. And I started off as a physicist and wound up with a bachelor's in history and philosophy of science. And I love that space and have remained in that space ever since. Here at the University of Guelph, we've got this wonderful program called the Bachelor of Arts in Science, which I think initially was perhaps meant for students like this as well, as students who couldn't decide. And it's turned into a major which often attracts now some of our best undergraduates. And the Bachelor of Arts in Science allows students to almost mix and match majors. So we've got chemistry and art history, computing and psychology, ecology and international development studies. They can pick almost any two things and put them together into a coherent degree program. And in fact, what the university helps them do is take these two things and help them articulate how and why they're connected. Zoology and English is another one, physics and theater studies. And it's a really, really fun degree. And the students who graduate, even if they go into a science graduate program, they tend to do extremely well. And I think our job is to help support that culture and then get those graduates out into the workforce where they will then promote it. I hope I've gone some way to answering the question. Anyway.
I think you've set up more questions than you have answers, but that's what we're here for. In fact, you've led us into a few more of the audience questions that we've got here. And one of those questions is, universities are having these dialogues about interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary spaces, courses, designs, but do you think that school secondary education spaces should actually be preparing students for a multidisciplinary environment? It shouldn't be the responsibility, asks this person, of just the universities. It should be the responsibility of the entire educational system. Dr. Malloy.
I would agree with that. I think part of the problem is there is such pressure coming from the perception of society and the very overt commentary by governments, in our case, whether it's a provincial or a federal government, to focus on STEM. And I think parents, hear that message that, if you want your student, your son or daughter to have a decent job, well, you've got to go into STEM. I think they get that information probably in high school, if not younger, which is misinformation. I mean, certainly you'll have a wonderful career in STEM, but I think the data and yes, Dr. Mccook, the common joke is if you have a liberal arts education that you end up as a barista making coffee. But the data, which again, we're very, very negligent in getting this information out there, but the data is that you can have a very good career in the liberal arts. And in fact, in terms of overall income, while a liberal arts graduate does start behind a STEM grad, within, I believe it's 10 to 15 years, you've already caught up. And because of the flexibility, adaptability, and all the other stuff we spoke about, the chances of you moving on to more senior positions is very highly likely. So you are not disadvantaged by taking a liberal arts degree. And in fact, in some ways, you are very much more advantaged. So taking this back to a societal perception, I think that what we need to do is convince decision makers and dare I say influencers to value I guess the notion of humanities, social science, liberal arts education, and not just the STEM disciplines.
So there's a question that's come in from the audience that I will put to all of you. We'll start with Dr. Sinha, which is, as far as the mindset of employers are concerned when they're hiring people, which seems to be understandably the largest concern, does the fact that people come from different backgrounds be perceived differently? What kind of shift would you like to see in the mindset of employers, and how would that translate specifically when it comes to ideas of salary parity and positional parity within that space? Dr. Sinha.
I'm just thinking, see, employers are still going to need some folks that come with some types of skills and training, which are more professionally oriented. And depending on which company you represent, you may be willing to pay more and be willing to pay a premium for people who come from a certain discipline. I think that has always existed, and to some extent that will remain in place, because you need that set of technical or professional skills in addition to the skills that we're talking about. And we'll put that aside. But I think beyond that, most jobs actually don't need that technical or professional skill. And for those, I do think that employers need to start to open their aperture much more. And the reward for the work or compensation should really be dependent on the output, the performance, rather than what background people come from. And I've seen this time and time again, because I've started businesses, worked in large companies, recruited people. Beyond a point, actually, over a period of time, after about 3-4 years, what you studied, where you studied, it just gets erased, or it gets so far pushed in the past. It's really just your current performance and just past and future potential that really makes a difference. I do think that people find it hard to judge that. For example, I'm sitting at ISB, and today is our graduation. And I remember in the early years, people found it tough to understand how do they hire somebody with an MBA from campus who has prior experience. Because the MBAs in India in those days were with no experience. So a campus MBA meant no experience, and they came from IIMs. And so people found it very hard. And then the question was, are they a lateral hire? Are they a mid-tier? Can we start them off at the bottom of the rung? Or how much should we pay them? And I think over time, the market has adjusted. We had to push them pretty hard. And I think I dare say that our initial graduates may have started at a disadvantage because people discounted them. Interestingly, I have a story on that too. When I got recruited with McKinsey and Company after I was a failure as an academic and didn't enjoy being one, I actually got a lower salary, no sign-on bonus, and I was much older, had much more experience than the MBAs in my cohort that was recruited. And I was told that I actually would take, I was called a diversified candidate. So I was a diversity candidate because I didn't have an MBA. And over a period of time, all that changed. And 3 of the last few global managing directors of McKinsey have been diversified candidates. But fast forward to 20, 30 years later in India, when I was trying to convince McKinsey to recruit from Ashoka, they only first looked at the economics and finance graduates. And I had to tell them, and especially because I knew them, that, hey, can you take a look at some of these political science and English majors as well? You'll be surprised. And interestingly, they've hired political science and English majors for the last few years, of course, in addition to the economics and finance majors. So this process is long, and I can't say that this is going to happen overnight, but I think people are realizing, people are changing. People have gone through experiences themselves. Their own children, the recruiters' children are going through these experiences. So that changes people's mindsets. So I do think it is happening. And I do think we have to be hopeful and we need to keep pushing the bar and the boundaries on.
Dr. Malloy, yes.
Could I make just a very, very quick comment? I'm sorry to jump in. 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with the CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. His name is Perrin Beatty. He's a former federal minister of defense, and he told me that when he's interviewing people at the head office for the Chamber of Commerce in Ottawa, he doesn't ask them what their degrees are. He said he didn't care. What he wanted were critical thinkers, flexible thinkers, adaptable thinkers. So. Right on point, Dr. Sinha. I think the more experienced employers realize that what your undergraduate degree is I won't say it's meaningless, but it may not really matter that much. I think the other characteristics they're looking for are, more of these quote unquote softer skills. So thank you.
Dr. Mccook?
And I'll just add, I was just going to add very quickly, I think Dr. Sinha's example is a really, really beautiful one of how universities can be activists to change these discourses, to get companies, get employers to think differently about the kinds of graduates we produce and their value professionally.
If I may, Dr. Sinha, I want to very quickly add that once upon a time in my journalistic career, I used to do a show where I would interview students of business schools across India. And I would do all of the IIMs and I would do ISB. And inevitably, you would have 22, 23-year-olds, all of them from engineering backgrounds at the IIMs, and then I'd get to ISB, and you'd have people between 25 and 55 from backgrounds as diverse as fashion, medicine, public health, all of whom were there to do their MBAs, and the conversations were radically more interesting from a purely journalistic perspective. So clearly that was something that stood out to me even then. We are running out of time for a conversation that really requires much longer than 1 hour. As Dr. Malloy said, probably requires a lifetime. But I would like to ask for some relatively brief closing statements on what you feel we would, on creative models really, that we should be looking to develop for multidisciplinary education going forward. Dr. Malloy, we'll start with you.
That's a heck of a question to ask off the cuff. Let me tell you what King's is doing. And King's University is an affiliate of Western University. We have a program, we call it the King's Promise, and in that program, students from first year to fourth year take a variety of seminars and workshops, and all professional skills, so resume writing, internships, mentorships, all that sort of thing. And part of that is helping those students communicate to employers what their degree means. So this is the sociologist that would go into, perhaps they're trying to get a job in a bank, or a philosopher getting a job, their skill set
Could you
is.
repeat that, Dr. Malloy? We lost you for about a second.
Oh, okay. I said that what we're trying to do is communicate to our students, or to teach our students how to communicate to employers, so that a sociologist can walk into a high-tech company and can, be able to convince them what the virtues of their degree are and why they should be hired. So I think that's a small step, but I think it's a significant one, and one that we haven't done for decades, hundreds of years, that we really need to really come to terms with the reality of our disciplines. And the other part of the King's Promise is that what we do is that if a student doesn't have a job in their discipline within 6 months, we invite them back for up to a year of free tuition. So we really try to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to job readiness. And I say that even though to some, to talk about careers as a function of a university is will get some people upset, because the purpose of a university is not to get a job. Well, that's true, but guess what? It is too. The reality is students go to university because they want a good job. And I think we're not serving them well if we don't prepare them for that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Dr. Malloy, Dr. McCook. You're muted.
I'll keep it brief, but I think a lot of the points have already been touched upon. And I'll just say the things that universities can do, I think one of them is to constantly pay attention to their curriculum. It's easy to roll out a curriculum and then just kind of let it roll. And I think at times being more activist in revisiting their curriculum from time to time to make sure it's keeping up with changes in the world is really key. I think it's also about giving students spaces. To get exposure either within a degree program, as we've alluded to, or by having interdisciplinary programs that will allow the more bold students to embrace the value kind of disciplines that involve both the sciences and the social science. I'd say the third one that for us is becoming increasingly important is cooperative education. And where the students will study for a couple of semesters and then do a semester at a work placement. Which I think intellectually, so it'll take them, say, 5 years to do a 4-year undergraduate degree, but then they graduate with a year's work experience. And I think that moving back and forth between a workplace and the classroom, it gives them that experience of being able to think about actively and continually about how their degree shapes their work life and vice versa.
Thank you, Dr. McCook. Dr. Sinha.
Very quickly, I want to build on Dr. McCook's point about workplace. I do think that all of university education has traditionally been, you go and learn, and then once you learn, you go do. So you learn to do. I think we need to also incorporate do to learn in our curriculum. And the people call it experiential, project-based, but most people just do lip service to that. I think really saying, and the co-op model in some of the universities around the world is very powerful. I think it's much more relevant today than it was before. So I think that's number one. Number two, I do think we need to bring in more practitioners into teaching. I think in India, you mentioned, Kajori, that you have been a journalist before. The fact that you've actually worked, I think, brings a certain element into and this is not to take anything away from folks who have been pure academics. We need them too. I'm not saying that we don't, but I do think we also have such a dearth of academics that we almost have it as a need and a necessity in our country. But I think that the curriculum and the experience for our students becomes that much richer when you involve people who are practitioners. And of course, I don't mean them to come in and just tell their war stories, but train them up as academics. And the last thing I would say is that every university should have one degree major, which is a no major degree, where people come in and they just explore. And I know that there's been criticism that this can be too airy-fairy, floozy, it doesn't add up to anything. But hey, if people want, let them have the flexibility. Let them face the consequences if there are going to be negative consequences. Allow them that freedom to explore. And that would be my last thought. Thank you so much for having me. Are you both gentlemen at 4 a.m. in your time zones? Oh my God,
Wow.
I just can't believe that you're doing this.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Mccook, and Dr. Sinha. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here for this discussion, and we hope we can take it forward very, very soon, go into the nitty-gritties a little bit more. But thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Really enjoyed it. Take care, everyone.
Yeah.